Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to continue my look back at some of the surprising releases from NECA of some very familiar screen heroes. And the figure in question today, of course, is the 1978 Superman as portrayed by Christopher Reeve. Much like the 1989 version of Batman that we took a look at last week, the 1978 version of Superman on the big screen left something of an indelible impression on audiences. In fact, so much so, it could be said that this is the cinematic foundation of the superhero genre on the big screen. If this film hadn't been successful, if it hadn't been believable, if it hadn't made that fantastic impression, if the special effects hadn't been up to snuff, if the writing hadn't been as good, and if the performances hadn't been as strong, then the superhero genre as we know and love it today, being so prolific and some of the biggest box office earners of the last 10 years, would never have come to be. And so a great debt is owed to this film, and unsurprisingly, it holds a unique soft spot in the hearts of many fans. So, when NECA decided to release a 7-inch scale version of Christopher Reeve's Superman from the 1978 film, a lot of fans could not be happier, because up until this point, there hadn't been another 7-inch scale version of this Superman. And straight away, I think we're onto a winner with the packaging. I really like the design here, clearly emulating the Fortress of Solitude. We can see those various crystals there. We have that fantastic metallic Superman logo in bold at the front of the packaging. It is completely text-free, which is lovely. And of course, that inner window packaging there showing off the Christopher Reeve action figure. I think it looks absolutely brilliant. I think this looks great on display and is really nice in its own right. When we look at the side panel, we can see that design has wrapped all the way around the packaging. I think this is an interesting approach. Probably doesn't lend itself to being put on display in side profile on a shelf, but it still looks very, very nice from the front and, as we'll see, from behind. Because on the reverse we have this fantastic image, this photograph of the figure. Now I suspect that this might be the quarter scale figure, something to do with the quality of the cape gives this away to me a little bit, and some of the paint apps are a little bit different to the one we see on the actual figure. But nevertheless, this looks really, really very nice, very presentable. You can put this on display quite comfortably and it looks really good. And you also notice there's a little bit of text here as well, a bit of a bio about the character and the film, which is a nice touch. It's not too much, not too little, just right. So let's look at the figure himself. Well, the first thing to say is that he's very bright and very colourful, which is exactly what I want to see. So he's definitely eye-catching and he certainly looks the part. Overall, I think the sculpting is very, very good. If we look at his head sculpt in particular, I think we've got a pretty strong likeness here of Christopher Reeve. Now, it's not quite perfect. I think it's maybe a little bit too narrow. It should have been it's just fractionally wider in the face there. But overall, I think this looks really good. They've got the S-curl there on his hairline, which looks pretty much spot on. It's nice and wavy. And I think they've got the blue of his eyes just right as well. So I think this looks really very good, actually. I think they've done a very good job of this. Now the sculpting of the body is quite interesting. It's got quite a hard texture to it. It's got like sort of almost like wavy line effect going on, which is a bit interesting. Now clearly this costume is very different to what we see in Hollywood blockbusters today. You know, obviously the emphasis these days is much more on muscle sets and lots of detailing and textures in costumes. Obviously this is a much simpler approach. This is pretty much what we see in the comic books. It is kind of a spandex costume, which is pretty pitch perfect really, but clearly this is a very different approach, and I think what they've tried to do with the figure is give it a little bit extra texture in the costume by giving it some very slight ridges. Now I actually think that's probably a bit more detrimental. It puts me off a little bit. I'd rather it was actually smooth as it looks in the film, but nevertheless the colours are very, very nicely applied. This looks pretty accurate. As I said, they're nice and bright and colourful. Bright yellow, bright blue, bright red works perfectly well here. The only gripe I have is about the S logo, the shield on the chest there. This has been engraved in, and obviously in the film it's very much more of a transfer, and I think that probably would have worked better if it had just been painted on rather than being sculpted in, because it just doesn't look quite right. The cape is a nice bright red fabric. It's a cotton material which works very well. It's very loose, and we'll look at the cape a little bit more in a moment, but we can see again the shield on the back of the cape in that perfect bright yellow transfer. I think this looks really good and pretty authentic to what we see on screen. Now, whilst I really like that this is a fabric cloak and that you can actually pose it in multiple ways, you can have it over the shoulder or behind him, and you can do different things with it. I much prefer this over a rubber cape or a plastic cape, which is quite limited and sculpted into 1 or 2 positions. I think this works much better for me. I really like this, and I like that it adds extra texture. The only problem is, though, that it does feel a little bit short to me. I feel like this cape should come down a little bit lower and meet just the top of his boot there, so this feels a little bit inaccurate. The hands he has in the box are these closed fists, which I think work very, very well, and his boots are also sculpted very nicely, and again, wonderfully painted there in that bright red colour. So I think this looks really good. This is pretty faithful to what we see on screen. I think they've done a very nice job of bringing this to life. Looking at articulation, he does have a ball joint in the head, and you get a huge range of motion out of this. It can move from side to side, it can spin all the way around, and of course it will even nod forwards and backwards as well. So a great range of motion here that you can do pretty much anything you want. You can have him looking anywhere you want him to, which is going to be key for this particular character. He also has ball joints in the shoulders, so he can lift his arms up a good healthy distance here, which is fantastic. Of course, there is a pin swivel at the elbow there as well, so that lower arm can spin all the way around, and it does hinge to roughly 90 degrees. There's another pin swivel at the wrist, so again, that wrist rotates all the way around, and it hinges forwards and backwards as well. Now, he does have a ball joint in the chest, so he can move from side to side at the waist, and he can sort of lean forwards and backwards from side to side. Now, it is quite a loose joint, and it does have a tendency to want to pop off. He also has ball joints in the hips, so his legs kick out to the side. There's also a swivel at the top of the boot cut there as well. The legs kick forwards and they kick back a little bit as well. And then there is that pin swivel at the knee there, so that lower leg can hinge to 90 degrees. It can also spin from side to side before there's an ankle pivot as well that allows that foot to hinge forwards and backwards fractionally and move from side to side. Naturally, Superman doesn't require an awful lot of accessories, but he does have an extra pair of hands, and these are his flat palm hands that allow him to be put into various flying poses. Sadly, the figure doesn't come with a display stand, so you're going to probably have to rustle up one of your own, but you can get him in some decent positions to kind of replicate that flight. Now, sadly, there isn't enough articulation in the sort of chest area that would allow him to be really put in a very comfortable flying pose, so you're going to have to persevere quite a bit and use your imagination to try and recreate that. He's always going to be sort of at an angle, more of a lean than a straight flying, unless you're able to employ some string, for example, literally hold him up. But it does look pretty good. I do like that these choice of hands that we have. We've got the fist there and, of course, the flat palm as well, which is really good for recreating a decent flying pose. So I thought I'd do a quick scale comparison so you can see how he scales against other Supermen in my collection. On the right hand side we have the DC Universe Superman. Of course, it's not meant to be the Christopher Reeves Superman, it is a comic book Superman, but you can see the difference in colour. I think is particularly interesting here. You can see how deep and dark the blue is on the right hand side versus the bright and colourful Christopher Reeve version. Similarly, here he is against the DC Films version of Henry Cavill's Man of Steel. Again, you can see they're in the same scale, they're both 7-inch figures, but we can see the crucial differences in articulation, the use of the cape, for example, and, of course, the colour scheme here. Again, just how much brighter the NECA version is of this version of Superman compared to the DC Films version of Man of Steel. And then finally, here he is standing next to the DC McFarlane comic book version of Superman. Again, just see that contrast in colours. It's just so much brighter on this NECA version, which I think works really, really well. It's very faithful to what we would expect of this version of Superman. And interestingly, in terms of the scale, though, we can see that probably the McFarlane version is, although it's 7 inches, actually just fractionally taller than the NECA version here. So there you have it. All told, I have to say this was a wonderful surprise release. I'm absolutely delighted to have an affordable 7-inch scale version of the Chris Reeves Superman. This is absolutely fantastic stuff. I think the articulation is pretty decent. It's not earth-shattering, but it's pretty solid. I really like the colours, the paint apps on this figure in particular work very, very well. And I do like the cape. I wish it was fractionally longer than it is, but I still think it serves. And I still think you can get some decent poses out of this figure all told. And ultimately, it's a great one to add to the line. So I think this is a really nice release from NECA. I think they've done a very good job of it, and I think it's definitely worth having in your collection if you're a fan. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.